And that's why you see the piece the anti-slavery movement used says, "Am I not a brother?" Remember the black that was kneeling there in chains, holding the chains up, said, "Am I not a brother?" Said, "We're all of one blood." The other was in Revelation 7:9. Revelation 7:9 is the passage where they said, "We see gathered around his throne at the end of the day, casting down their crowns before him, are people from all races, all tribes, all languages, all." And these guys said, "We think there's really only two races in the world, those who know God and those who don't know God." And that's the way they drew races up. That's why in Massachusetts, there never was a time when blacks could not vote. That's why in Massachusetts, like in New Hampshire, elsewhere, blacks were elected to office. So many of the black heroes of the American Revolution came out of there. They had a whole different view of man because of what they had in the scriptures. See, we'll talk about Jamestown, but we won't talk about what happened there. We won't talk about the fact that when the Constitution was ratified in states like Maryland and cities like Baltimore, more blacks than whites voted to ratify the U.S. Constitution in Baltimore. Oh, blacks didn't vote back then? Yeah, they did.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. At the time of the American Revolution, numerous other nations also had revolutions, yet 200 years later, America is the only of those nations still under its original form of government. Is this just good luck? Not according to Founding Father Benjamin Rush. He declared, "I do not believe that the Constitution was the offspring of inspiration, but I am as perfectly satisfied that it is as much the work of a divine providence as any of the miracles recorded in the Old and New Testament." George Washington agreed. In fact, he declared, "I should be pained to believe that the United States have forgotten that divine interposition which was so often manifested during our Revolution, or that they fail to consider the omnipotence of that God who is alone able to protect them. Our founders acknowledged that our national success had come from God."
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact Wall Builders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
But see, what we get is a Southern view of American history. The Southern was really ugly, but there's a lot of good stuff that was happening up north that we won't talk about. We'll talk about what happened in the South, but we won't talk about what happened in the North, and it's all part of history. You got to show the good, the bad, the ugly. So we have that. We don't know that they started the Civil Rights Movement. And by the way, I was recently at Southern University Law School, black law school in Louisiana, and I put this slide up, and I said, isn't it unfortunate that these guys were just a bunch of racists and bigots and slave owners? And everybody said, yeah, that's pretty bad. I said, by the way, who up there owned slaves? And they all pointed to Thomas Jefferson. And I said, yeah, Jefferson owned slaves. Give me somebody else that owned slaves. Nobody gave me a second name. Wait a minute. One guy owned slaves. On the basis of one guy owning slaves, the other 55 owned slaves? One guy owned slaves, so they're all racist? I said, how about guys, for example, let me take it down here. Benjamin Rush and Ben Franklin, these guys founded the first abolition society in America. It's an act of civil disobedience against King George III. He said, you can't free blacks. They said, watch us. It was actually, this document says, begun in the year 1774. That's the year King George III vetoed the anti-slavery societies, and they did it anyway. It was also Benjamin Rush who became the national anti-slavery leader, started anti-slavery society in every state. You also have folks like Ben Franklin who joined with Francis Hopkinson, and in 1768 they started a whole chain of schools for black Americans teaching academics and Christianity, because you weren't supposed to be educating blacks back then. They said, watch this. And so these two guys started a whole chain of schools for black Americans. Stephen Hopkins is the first governor to sign an anti-slavery law. His state had tried to end slavery. The king vetoed it. Once we separated from Great Britain, he did end slavery and passed a law. We couldn't do it while we were British citizens. We could as Americans. You have John Witherspoon at Princeton University, president of Princeton. He taught both blacks and whites in his courses. You also have William Ellery, who did the first federal anti-slavery law. You have Richard Stockton, the anti-slavery leader in New Jersey. You have Charles Carroll, an anti-slavery leader in Maryland. You have Richard Henry Lee, anti-slavery leader in Virginia, and on it goes. But see, what happens is we know one, and so they all are bad. That's deconstructionism. We get taught the exception, not the rule. You know, how is it that we get taught about the, and by the way, James Wilson, we talked about him earlier, he taught in law school that if you own slaves, it's a violation of God's law, it's a violation of natural law. You cannot, as a Christian, own slaves. That was the position they took. That's the position he took as a Supreme Court justice. We don't hear about these guys. See, what we do is we get a steady dose of the ones who own slaves and nothing about the ones who didn't. That's deconstructionism. So this is the way we've been shaped to think negative about America. Most people, you ask them, give me 5 things good about America, 5 things bad, they'll give you the bad first, because we've been trained to think negative, not positive. So that's an aspect of it. Now, let me hit the other deconstruction aspect, and that's faith in the founders. I want to close with this segment. We're told the founders didn't have faith. America's unchristian beginnings, LA Times, the founding fathers were deists who rejected the divinity of Jesus. You see here a whole chain of newspapers on the East Coast. The authors of the Declaration were enemies of Christ. You go out to professors and Professor Stephen Morris. The founding fathers were not Christians. I don't care what anybody says they were. I mean, here's our academics again weighing in. And people buy that. When I was at Duke University Law School, I put this slide up and said, who you guys recognize up there? And again, everybody found Jefferson, and they all found Franklin. And I said, there's 56 guys there. Nobody could give me a third name. They could give me 2, but not a third. I said, well, let me help you. Let me just take you across the front row there. I mean, the front row, you got Richard Henry Lee, and beside him you get George Clinton. Then you come across, and there's Sam Adams. The guy looking opposite direction back is Charles Carroll. The guy on the front row with the brown jacket, Robert Morris. Beside him is Benjamin Rush. The guy leaning on his elbow, it's Elbridge Gerry. Beside him is Robert Tree. And I can go through the other 54 names, and I'll go, who? Never heard those names before. Isn't it interesting? We've all been trained to recognize the 2 least religious founding fathers. We can all find the least religious, but we don't have a clue who that. But as I pointed out, 29 of these guys held seminary or Bible school degrees. But again, today we get taught the exception, not the rule. We learn about the non-religious guys, not the religious guys. Let me take you through some of the guys we used to learn about. John Witherspoon right here, busting on gospel evangelists in his generation, has more than a dozen published volumes of gospel sermons. They were bestsellers. Americans couldn't wait for the next one to come out. This guy, president of Princeton, served on 100 committees in Congress, also responsible for this work right here. This is from 1791. That is America's very first family Bible. He did this Bible so that families could have Bible studies together. So this came from a signer of the Declaration, and he has a ton of political writings. There's no shortage of Witherspoon writings. You read his writings, you find statements like this. He says, I entreat you in the most earnest manner to believe in Jesus Christ, for there's no salvation in any other. If you're not reconciled to God through Jesus Christ, if you're not clothed with the spotless robe of his righteousness, you must forever perish. That kind of sounds evangelical. I'm not used to atheists talking like that. He's one of our great atheist founding fathers. But who's ever heard of John Witherspoon? You see, they have the same difficulty with Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson on the 4th of July was one of only 2 founders who signed the Declaration of Independence. The rest of them signed it on August the 2nd. So he's one or 2 guys to sign it. He did Thompson's Bible. You can still buy Thompson's Bible in any bookstore today. It comes from a founding father. He's a theologian, and his theology was really simple. Theology was not a complicated issue for him. You look in his writings, and by the way, he also did a synoptic gospel where he took all 4 gospels and put them together chronologically so that you can read the synoptic gospel. You get all 4 gospels together, but you get to read from start to finish chronologically the life of Jesus. So you don't have to jump between the 4 gospels to put it. It's a cool book, but he was a theologian. This is his theology. Pretty simple. He says, I am a Christian. I believe only in the Scriptures and in Jesus Christ my Savior. Pretty simple theology. But that's what it was for him. You also have Benjamin Rush. When he died in 1813, the other founders still alive, like John Adams, said that Benjamin Rush was one of our 3 most notable founding fathers. They say you got George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He started 5 universities. 3 of them still go today. He wrote the first chemistry textbook in the United States, the first psychiatry textbook in the United States. He's also started the first abolition movement. He founded the first black denomination, AME denomination. He's also called the father of American medicine. 3,000 kids had their medical degrees with his signature on the diploma. He started the American College of Physicians. He trained the first black physicians in America. He served as a professor of medicine at 3 universities at the same time. In addition to signing the Declaration ratifying the Constitution, he served in 3 presidential administrations. He's the director of the U.S. Mint. He did the first faith-based prison reform, and I can just keep going. It would seem like a guy who did that much, we might hear about him occasionally. Nah, we don't hear about him. I wonder why in the world we don't hear anything about Benjamin Rush. Maybe it's because he's the guy who started the Sunday school movement. If you've ever been to Sunday school and enjoyed yourself, you can thank him for it because he started it. But that wouldn't make him an atheist founding father if we all knew he started Sunday schools. He also wrote this work. Let's see if I can find it right here. I'll put it aside. Oh, no, I got it here. Here it is. Right there. That's the Constitution for the very first Bible Society ever formed in America. Now, why would he start a Bible Society? He tells us. He says if we can get Americans to read the Bible, he said two things will happen. Number one, they'll become Christians. And number two, if they'll obey what they read in the Bible, we'll solve all of our social problems. We won't have slavery or crime. And he went through all the things we wouldn't have. So he wants every American to own and read a Bible. And in looking to do that, he came up with a new way to print Bibles. It was called stereotyped printing.